Welcome to Have It Out with Galloway, where every week we have out the great issues of the day. And I have my say, you can have yours on the video wall. As the Rolling Stones once sang, this could be the last time. By which I mean it is distinctly possible that by next week's show, the world will be engulfed in war. Certainly the region from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf may very well be in flames. This is because fundamentally of the behavior of the apartheid state of Israel, the European colonial state of Israel, which for 75 years has tormented, has tortured, has murdered, displaced, and dispersed millions of Palestinian people. And Iran's long-standing and absolutely sincere conviction that it is a duty, a religious duty, a duty in humanity to stand by the Palestinian people. Make no mistake about it. If Iran did not stand with Palestine, none of what's happening, none of what's being said and threatened would be remotely the case. Iran would be courted, as it once was, as a potential ally for the West in the East. Iran would be a darling, as it once was, of the Western Empire. But Iran has never given up on the Palestinian people, even when others have. I spoke in the House of Commons yesterday. I'm trending in Twitter in the UK because, frankly, I was the only adult in the room, pointing out that the Prime Minister of Britain made a lengthy statement about the events of last weekend without a single word of condemnation or even a single word at all about the blatantly, brazenly, illegal, violent, fatally violent act conducted by the apartheid state on the 1st of April in Damascus. As I said in the Parliament yesterday, not one word did the Prime Minister say about the destruction of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, in violation of the Vienna Convention, in violation of all rules and laws of the United Nations Charter and of international law. And yet, obviously, the events on the 1st of April were the proximate cause, reason for the events of last weekend over in the skies over the apartheid state. But not one word was mentioned until I rose to my feet. The fact that my intervention has now been viewed by millions and millions of people, when so many dozens of people spoke, many of them much more powerful than me in terms of the positions that they hold, the fact that it is my intervention that is dominating the public discourse proves something very important. The British public are not fools. They know essentially what's going on in the Middle East and that Palestine is the heart of the matter. The massacre of 35,000 and more, most of them women and children, trapped in a cage with nowhere to run, with nowhere to hide, with no anti-aircraft potential, no aircraft, no warships, no bomb shelters, not like the bunker that Netanyahu spent the weekend in the basement of the house of an American billionaire in Tel Aviv. The truth is, the British public and the Western public know that their governments are on the road to nowhere, making ourselves more and more hated, more and more imperiled and in danger, our interests damaged everywhere by our unending support for a tiny little country of just a few million people on the Mediterranean. We'll be discussing with first-rate, first-line, top-class guest, Dr. Seyed Mohammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. And we'll be taking your calls on our video wall. This is Have It Out with Galloway. Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi is the head of the American Studies Department at the University of Tehran. He's become a very familiar face and voice in Western media because he's not easy for them to dismiss. He's not easy for them to rubbish. He speaks the language. He speaks the language of wisdom, of international diplomacy, statecraft, and the language of finding solutions to problems rather than exacerbating them. I frequently have the honor of having him as a guest on my shows, and I have that honor again today. Now, very dangerous times, Professor. Welcome to the show. Will this be my last show? Is there going to be an all-out war by next week?
Well, I hope we are all able to benefit from your excellent show for a very long time. I certainly plan to be watching. I do think it's quite possible that there will be an escalation. If the Israeli regime says they're going to target Iranians again, then if they don't do so, it would be a humiliation in itself. So I think they've put themselves in a position where they feel that they have to carry out an attack. And this is where I think the West miscalculates and misunderstands, because the West constantly believes its own propaganda, like in Ukraine, where the Ukrainians were always winning, and then suddenly everyone sees that they're losing. It's because of the Western propaganda that has for 2 years been saying that they've been wiping out the Russian armed forces, and then suddenly everyone wakes up to the reality that Kiev is under threat. In the case of Iran and the Israeli regime, the Israelis have lost in Gaza on the battlefield. They've lost on the border with Lebanon on the battlefield. They've created hatred for the regime across the globe because of the genocide. And after striking the Iranian embassy, the globe was outraged. The European countries and the United States are marginalized nowadays in the international community. They, of course, support the strike on the embassy, which is seen as outrageous, just as their support for the genocide is seen as outrageous across the globe. But their propaganda basically has been that the Israelis won when the Iranians struck back and retaliated and punished Israel for the airstrike, whereas that is absolutely not the case. It is the opposite. The Iranians sent large numbers of very inexpensive and old drones, each costing at most $10,000, and they told the world well in advance, because the Iranians wanted to draw the fire towards those drones. They wanted the Israeli regime and the Americans to throw everything they had at the drones. And that's what they did. So the Iranians spent maybe a couple of $1 million on the drones, and the Israelis spent over $1.3 billion in missiles to shoot down those drones. And they didn't get any intelligence from Iran because they were all old. And the Iranians gained a huge amount of intelligence about Israeli and US capabilities. And of course, they depleted their reserves of drones, whereas Iran has endless amounts of drones and missiles. Then the Iranians fired a number of older missiles, again, no new technology, getting rid of these old missiles. They also were like the drones, fire to draw the anti-aircraft missiles towards themselves, and they were successful as well. So these drones and those older missiles, which had, as I said, no new technology in them for the West or Israel to discover, they all fulfilled their objective. They forced the other side to carry out a costly missile attack on the drones and missiles, and they gathered a huge amount of information. So they were decoys. They were all decoys. Then, to send the real message to Israel, they sent a handful, maybe 10 to 20, I'm not quite sure about the number, of missiles to an airbase in the south, where the F-35s are, which bombed Gaza and which bombed the embassy, and a military intelligence base in the north. Those missiles all got through. Even those missiles weren't Iran's latest technology. They were older missiles, but they went right through the defense, and they showed the Israeli regime, and there's footage of them. There's footage, at least a number of drones and satellite. There's footage of the drone striking and satellite pictures showing that they struck. So it was a success from the Iranian point of view. But the problem is that when the West puts out this propaganda, as usual, they believe their own propaganda. And I think that may actually help to create miscalculation. And then this time around, if the Israelis strike, which they've threatened to do, the Iranians will hit back much harder. It will not be like what we saw 2-3 days ago. The Iranians have gathered their intelligence. The number of drones and missiles will be much greater. They will not be giving days of telling everyone days before that they're going to carry out the attack. It will be a sudden counterstrike if the Israeli regime does anything. And there will be thousands instead of hundreds. So the Israeli regime will be devastated. The Iranians have promised to give a crushing response this time around. So if the Americans and the Israelis keep gloating, then they may do something very stupid, and then they'll see the reality of Iran's capabilities.
We'll explore the likely meaning of that reality in a minute, Professor. But on the subject of hypocrisy, let's take a look at our VT of the kind of hypocrisy that's been on view over the last couple of days on the subject of Iran. Take a look at this.
There is a massive degree of difference between what Israel did in Damascus and, as I said, 301 weapons being launched by the state of Iran at the state of Israel. For the first time, a state-on-state attack. 101 ballistic missiles, 36 cruise missiles, 185 drones. That is a degree of difference. Yeah. And I think a reckless and dangerous thing for Iran to have done. And I think the whole world can see all these countries that have somehow wondered, well, you know, what is the true nature of Iran? It's there in black and white.
What would Britain do if a hostile nation flattened one of our consulates?
Well, we would take the very strong action.
And Iran would say that that's what they did?
Well, what they did, as I said, was a massive attack.
So they were right to respond, but they overreacted, is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that the attack they carried out was on a very large scale, much bigger than people expected.
They have a right to respond?
Well, countries have a right to respond when they feel they've suffered an aggression. Of course they do. But look at the scale of that response.
Mr. Speaker, with this attack, Iran has once again shown its true colours. They are intent on sowing chaos in their own backyard, on further destabilising the Middle East. Our aim is to support stability and security, because it is right for the region, and because, although the Middle East is thousands of miles away, it has a direct effect on our security and prosperity at home. So we are working urgently with our allies to de-escalate the situation and prevent further bloodshed. We want to see calmer heads prevail, and we are directing all our diplomatic efforts to that end. I can confirm that our planes did shoot down a number of Iranian attack drones. I don't want to pay tribute to the bravery and professionalism of our pilots flying into the face of danger to protect civilians.
Iran launched an unprecedented aerial attack against Israel, and we mounted an unprecedented military effort to defend Israel. And together with our partners, we defeated that attack. The United States is committed to Israel's security. We're committed to a ceasefire that will bring the hostages home and preventing conflict from spreading beyond what it already has. We're also committed to the security of our personnel and partners in the region, including Iraq. The partnership between Iraq and the United States is critical.
Iran, the #1 global sponsor of terror, has exposed its true face as the destabilizer of the region and the world. And now, right now, is when the world must stop ignoring Iran's crimes and take action. As Iran's mask has fallen, the world's complacency must also fall. The mask comes off and the gloves must come on. So I ask you, and be honest with yourselves, what would you do? What would you do if you were in Israel's shoes? How would you react if your existence was threatened every single day? While the Ayatollah regime thinks, they only think, that Israel is a frog in a boiling water, that we are becoming accustomed to the threats on our survival and won't notice until it's too late, they are wrong. You are wrong. This attack crossed every red line, and Israel reserves the legal right to retaliate. We are not a frog in boiling water. We are a nation of lions.
Madam President, Excellencies, Iran has no intention of engaging in conflict with the US in the region. We demonstrated our commitment to peace by exercising our restraint about involving the US Army in intercepting Iranian drones and missiles bound for military targets in the occupied Palestinian territories. This underscores our dedication to de-escalating tension and avoiding the expansion of conflict. However, if the US initiate military operation against Iran, its citizen, or its security and interest, Iran will use its inherent right to respond proportionately. I thank you.
Quite a parade, I'm sure you'll agree. My personal favourite was David Cameron when asked on Sky News in the unlikely figure of Kay Burley, who became the biggest journalist in the country, with this question. When Cameron was fulminating about what Iran had done in response to the attack on its embassy, he was asked by Kay Burley, well, what would Britain do if such a thing happened to one of our embassies? And he more or less said we'd do exactly the same as Iran has done. A real parade, Professor, of hypocrisy. But let's move on from them and talk about you, talk about Iran. I think there's a very strong case for saying, as George W. Bush might have put it, that they've all misunderestimated Iran. They think of Iran as some kind of, I don't know, a Victorian-era northwest frontier province. But the reality is, Iran is a real substantial military power with 41 million people of fighting age, as opposed to 3 million people of fighting age in the apartheid state. Do you think they have, that this all stems from an underestimation of Iranian capability?
Yes, I think that they forget that even after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the US victory in Kuwait over the foolish Saddam Hussein, when the United States was at the top of the world and they became what someone once called a hyperpower, and we had reached supposedly the end of history, as Fukuyama said. Back then, the United States never dared to attack Iran because Iran was much more powerful than Iraq or Afghanistan. In the 1990s, they didn't do it. After they invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, they didn't do it because Iran was simply too powerful. And the ideology that dominates Iranian society, especially this the view, this religious ideology, and this the way in which people in Iran view Karbala and Imam Hussein, this the Americans know that there would be, they always knew that there would be many people who would stand against their aggression, and ultimately that the Americans would lose. The Iranians would be highly motivated in the defense of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so the Americans always threatened, they constantly threatened the country, but they always stood back and were careful not to enter Iranian territory. That was then, but this is now. Iran today is much more powerful. It has developed a very high-tech military industry. The West claims that Iran is assisting the Russians in and giving them advanced technology to fight their war in Ukraine. Whether it's true or false is irrelevant. The point is that they acknowledge Iran's advanced capabilities, its advanced technology, its advanced weapons systems that have been developed indigenously. And Iran today has allies across the region. Back then, Iran was isolated. And after the Americans invaded Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, Iran was surrounded by American bases and American soldiers. Today, Iran has allies in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and the US allies across the region are despised because their own population, their populations are witnessing a genocide in Gaza take place in front of our eyes as we speak, but their regimes do nothing, if not support the Israelis directly or indirectly carry out the genocide. So these regimes are becoming increasingly vulnerable. Those that do trade with Israel, those who do business or who have political contacts or who have military cooperation, they are losing their legitimacy in the eyes of their own people. Indeed, even in Turkey, despite the rhetoric of the president, we've seen how Turkey has continued to do business as usual with the Israeli regime, provided with fuel from the Caucasus and Central Asia, export and import goods. And where did that lead the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, during the local elections? He was wiped out. Why? Because many of his supporters went and voted for other parties, both religious and secular. So those that are siding with Israel are growing weaker. Those that are siding with the resistance are growing stronger. And the resistance is not just Iran and those and its partners in Yemen and Lebanon and elsewhere. The resistance is growing across the world. The global South has turned against Israel. And we see that young people and people from all walks of life in the West have turned against Israel. Young Jews, young Christians, young Muslims, young Hindus, people from different walks of life. They are now a part of this broader resistance against genocide, against what the Brazilian president called the Holocaust, effectively. And I think that the isolation of Israel and its regional friends will increase, and the isolation of the West will increase, and that puts Iran and the resistance in a commanding position.
Indeed so. Professor Marandi, as always, thank you for that tour of the horizon. Let me turn to our video wall. What a splendid array of public experts we have. Dennis Ballantyne is, I think, the first that I want to talk with. He's in New York. Dennis, what would you like to ask?
first time I've used the video link. Can you hear me, George?
Very clearly. The whole world can. Well done.
Thank you. First, congratulations on your victory in Rochdale, and thank you for all the good work that you do.
Thank you, sir.
My point is, I've been thinking about, with all the good work that you do and all the other commentators, analysts, there are certain limitations to rational discourse. And the question that you've asked a number of times to Professor Marandi, actually the last time he was on Moats, is why does the West bow down to Israel the way it does? And why are there so many, quote, friends of Israel in the British Parliament? And why are there no friends of Zimbabwe, for example? So I considered this question. I think that ideological Zionism is rooted in what I'm calling the collective psychopathology of the British and Western imperialism. And I think that if Israel is exposed for what it is, and if it fails, that the entire enterprise which created and sustains Zionism will dissolve with it. This is not so with other Western colonial enterprises. India gained independence, so did South Africa. The empire remained. When Israel ceases to exist, when, not if, so too then, I believe, will the empire of chaos. The ideology will be exposed and will dissolve. So in a nutshell, the survival of Israel is essential to the survival of Western civilization as we know it.
Well, that's a very interesting, if somewhat apocalyptic analysis, Dennis. You may be right, you may be wrong, or I may be right, which is that the best way forward for Western countries is to begin to look for win-win solutions everywhere, instead of insisting on zero-sum game outcomes everywhere. It's my belief that there is no rational reason why the Western countries cannot tolerate or accept, even in time welcome, a secular state in Israel-Palestine, between the river and the sea, where everyone lives as an equal citizen. That doesn't threaten our way of life, doesn't even threaten the capitalist way of life or their hegemony in Western countries. They've made, in my opinion, a fetish over this little country that they call Israel. They hail as the only democracy in the region, utterly absurdly, given that millions of Palestinian people live there with no vote, but subject to military rule by Israel for more than 50 years in one case, in some cases, and 75, 76 years in another. They try to persuade people in the West that Israel are PLU, people like us, and that they are besieged by the other, all the while having the closest possible and very, very profitable relationships with Arab countries who are not PLU. They're just people who accept Western domination. Dennis, challenging point. Thanks for making it. Let me go next to London, to Seyed Jafar. Seyed Jafar, what would you like to say?
How are you, George?
By the grace of God, good, thank you.
Yes, good to hear. George, just a couple of points. I'll keep it short and sweet. I know you've got loads on. First of all, I think this whole Gaza situation is driven by the acquisition of the gas deposits. That's my view. I think that's why you've got this total support from the full West they need to recover gas at 1p a kilowatt, because we're paying 6 to 10 at the moment because there's no Nord Stream. So I think we need to, that's been kind of just hidden under all of this. So that's my first view. I'd like to get your view on that. The second thing I wanted to say is, can you, what kind of response do you see from Israel? Because they're severely affected by the issue of the ego. What kind of response can you see their ego causing them to have to the Iranian, let's say the marketing that Iranian did for the world to see what their capacity was that night? And that's my 2 points.
Great couple of questions there. The elephant in the room in Parliament yesterday was both sides of the aisle, who are really, of course, one side, the Uni party, were calling for restraint. But they never dealt with the very real probability, according to Professor Marandi, that there will be no restraint. And what are the Western governments going to do then, when and if Israel attacks Iran? What are the Western governments going to do then, especially given that both Russia and China have made it abundantly clear at the UN and elsewhere that they stand with Iran in this affair? So there's no question in my doubt that their ego is a powerful thing. I don't doubt that if he did get through on the phone, little Rishi Sunak, who might have been one of the people whose calls Netanyahu didn't take because he's not important enough in this picture, but I've no doubt that these Western leaders are urging restraint, precisely for the reasons that Professor Marandi gave, that if there is an attack on Iran, Iran will answer it in devastating dimensions, with devastating consequences. And that will then pitch America, Britain, France, etc., into the conundrum, well, what are we going to do now when there's flames in both countries, and where retaliation begets retaliation? Where will it all end? On your first point, I think that there's never only one reason. It's one damn thing after another. And of course, gas and oil is a factor, although that gas and oil will not be on shore for many, many years. There are all kinds of legal problems that will exist if Israel tries to steal land, steal oil and gas, which belongs to Gaza, which legally is illegally occupied territory, belongs to Palestine, belongs to the Palestine National Authority, actually, in terms of its legal status. These oil companies will not be able to go in and simply harvest it, and in any case, it will not be harvestable for many years to come. Ditto the Ben Gurion Canal, ditto the wish to build luxury apartments along the beach and so on. These are all factors, for sure. These are all things, but it's never just one thing. It's one damn thing after another. Thank you, my friend, for that call. I can't resist going to Alaska, where Sam is in Anchorage in Alaska. Sam, what would you like to say?
Hi, George. Thanks for having me on here. First of all, I think Gaza is the primary narrative here. Iran is more in the background. But the thing about the last couple of days is that Iran has made more of a dent in the situation than the Houthis have.
Yeah, go on.
So my question is, should we give Iran the Nobel Peace Prize for this year instead of the Houthis?
Well, of course, neither will get the Nobel Peace Prize. You have to be a warmonger for the empire to get the Nobel Peace Prize. But you're right, absolutely right, that Iran has done something unprecedented in that Israel has never faced this kind of threat from its adversaries before. Although when I hear the word unprecedented, I realize that the journalists today are so young or so stupid or both that they don't remember, they never saw Operation Shock and Awe over Baghdad. They never saw the almost weekly bombardment of Beirut and of Damascus and of the cities and towns in the Yemen and so on. It's like it's unprecedented when it's happening to people like us, rather than when people like us are dealing that devastation out to others. But there's no doubt that in 75 years, other than the heroism of the Arab armies in 1973, betrayed then as now by Jordan, by the father of the current king, King Hussein, as was, who warned the Israelis of the Arab attack plan in the October War of 1973. But since then, Israel has never been seriously contended with by any other Arab or Muslim country, not by Turkey, not by Saudi Arabia, not by any other state in the Muslim world. Iran has stepped forward and taken on the mantle. And a lot of people don't like that. That is for sure. Let me go to Mr. Muhammad Adam Fulwala in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Muhammad, welcome.
Thank you very much. First of all, I hope you're doing well. And before I start, I would like to tell you how much I admire your confidence while speaking for the Palestinian issue, and I wish that I could have that confidence to speak that way.
Thank you.
I'll keep my question short regarding Europe. It feels like the tide in Europe is changing for more Palestinian support. What are your thoughts on this? And considering Germany's history, what is it going to take for the Europeans to stand against this genocide? Thank you.
Well, thank you. And first of all, you will gain more confidence. It's like the American golfer Jack Nicklaus, when someone told him that he'd played a lucky shot. He said, it's funny, the more I practice, the luckier I get. The more you speak, the more you do things like you've just done, the more confident you will become. I'm confident of that. The tide is very definitely turned in Europe. If I tell you, Mohammed, that when I became first involved in the Palestine question in 1975, which is not yesterday, you could have fitted all the supporters of the PLO as was in a very small hall in Britain. But now you could not fit the supporters of the Palestinian cause into all of central London and spilling over the bridges onto the south side also. The truth is, in every country in the West, the Palestinian cause has become the moral center of global events. It's become the cause of this century in the way that perhaps the American war on Vietnam was such in the 1960s and early 70s. The problem is we don't live in a democracy. We talk about democracy all the time, but if democracy means people's rule, which it does literally in Greek, the rule of the people, then clearly we don't have that. Not just actually on Palestine, but many, many other things, where the public are overwhelmingly in one place, the politicians overwhelmingly in another. And nowhere more, obviously, is that true than in Germany. We have a government in Germany which is supposedly a Labour Green Party government, which currently, between the two of them, between both parties, commands around 20% of the support of the electorate, with 80% of the people against them. And yet they double down and double down and double down. Thanks, Mohammed, for that. Let's go to Matthew in Bath in England. Let's go to Bath. Why not? Go ahead, Matthew.
Morning, George.
Good morning.
I am hoping and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that what Iran has done is to restore deterrence in the region. But I am not sure if that is a correct assessment. And just because Iran seems relatively restrained over the years in its state-based attacks, and obviously the most recent attack had extremely limited casualties, I still think that alongside its proxy forces, it might be that Iran overall is just as reckless as Israel. And of course, that was perhaps evidenced on October the 7th, where there was at least some support for that initial attack. Are you comfortable with Iran flexing its muscles again in the region? Or do you think that what it's been doing recently is restoring deterrence and some kind of stability?
I honestly think the opposite. I would be more critical of Iran's lack of boldness in some respects. I mean, how many attacks on Iran have there been? There wasn't just the attack on Iran in the embassy in Damascus. There was the attack on Iranian personnel in Beirut just a couple of weeks before. There have been untold numbers of terrorist attacks clearly mounted by Israeli proxies. Isn't it interesting, Matthew, how America has allies, but Iran has proxies? Let's call them all proxies, or let's call them all allies. I prefer the word allies. The allies of Iran in the region could have done much more. So far from Iran flexing its muscles, I think it's been extraordinarily patient. They call that doctrine strategic patience. And that strategic patience was bound to run out sometime. And clearly it ran out in Damascus on April 1st. And who sincerely could blame them for that? I honestly don't think that any country in the world could be more reckless than Zionist Israel. And not just yesterday, not this year, not this decade, not this century, but for decade after decade. Breathtaking recklessness in a way which has imperiled their whole state project. I mean, if you think of what happened to the Prime Minister who negotiated the Oslo agreements, he was murdered by the supporters of Netanyahu on the streets of Tel Aviv in Dizengoff Square in public. They murdered him. That's the kind of recklessness which the Zionist state has become infamous for. So no, I actually think that Iran has been extraordinarily patient, more patient than I would be, for example. I've said this for a decade. Iran refuses to acquire a nuclear weapon, although it quite evidently, scientifically, could do so probably very quickly indeed, but it refuses to have one. I've said for at least the last 15 years, Iran, if I was running Iran, I would definitely get myself a nuclear weapon. because Iran is confronted by countries that all have nuclear weapons. And why should Iran be vulnerable to the ultimate military attack when they could acquire a deterrent like we have in Britain? That's the case for the British bomb, isn't it? That it's a deterrent. Well, if it's a deterrent for us, why would it not be a deterrent for Iran? I think you'll find that it would be. Thanks for that call, Matthew. Let's go to Zebonisa Rao in London. Zebonisa, welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here, and greetings to everyone. So my question is a mixture of kind of frustration, complaint, and finally a question. It's a follow-up to your last program where it was mentioned the greed of governments and the Pope being Catholic discussion. Mm-hmm. So we've witnessed a 6-month-long genocide. We spent every day analyzing, assessing how will this country react, what will happen next. At the same time, logics and facts, humanity and law, they no longer exist. They don't exist for the criminals in power. We pray for a positive end to the conflict. South Africa, the Houthis and Iran, they are the only heroes in the story. So, I mean, I would pose the question, I know you've touched on it just now, that the elephant in the, another elephant in the room is that the world governments are actually supporting basically a business plan through Israel. It's land, oil, gas, ethnic cleansing. Financial gain is their motivator. And when financial gain is involved, then human nature will not give up under any circumstance. It doesn't matter how many deaths, what kind of havoc it wreaks. This is the only fact that matters. So my complaint is that why isn't this addressed directly? And my question, and the second part of it is that what if we stop working through the established channels and fitting into the required narratives, wondering why we're in the same place? The definition of a democracy, isn't that the opposite of a dictatorship? And it feels like we are under a global dictatorship. I'm sure that the people in power want to change the status quo, and they would know how to. But as an example, a major hurdle in the fact that the UN has military power that it cannot use is that the P5 member states' consensus is impossible. So the present rules that we live under are corrupt and are essentially, they're a cage for us. And they're not even being followed by Israel and the Western governments. What can the vast majority of the world who wants them changed, what can they do to change them? And there's a term.
Well, in two words, ma'am, popular power, people's power. We have to find ways to assert our popular power over the prevailing orthodoxy which misgoverns us. And I'll come back to that, how we can do that in a minute. But I'm one of these, and I've been, if you think about it, for more than half of my adult life, I have been sitting in the British Parliament, as I am again now. I've been a part of the debates in which this and that structure of so-called international law, of rules-based orders, and all the other guff that we hear endlessly. And I concluded long ago that all of this is just lipstick on a pig. And the point about lipstick is that it can be wiped off any time. It's there for the prettification of what is essentially a pig with all its ugliness. But if necessary, the lipstick can easily be wiped off. And we're seeing that now. You see, I'm so old, I remember when Britain prided itself on being not corrupt, unlike Johnny Foreigner, who was always said to be governed by corrupt politicians, corrupt governments, had an independent civil service which served the public and not any political party, which had a police force that you could safely anticipate that if your children were in trouble, the first thing they should do is ask a policeman. that had a court system that was independent from the political process and where you could expect justice, that had a BBC, which was the gold label of international journalism, that had an armed forces that were there to defend us and had defended us for a time alone against the Nazi hordes, that we had freedom of speech, that we had a genuine democracy. All of these things, every one of the things that I have just adumbrated, is now a shadow of its former self, except where it no longer exists at all, where no one even pretends that it exists. So I don't believe we're living either under the United Nations Charter of International Law, which was the pre-1999 spoken iteration of how we live, or a rules-based international order, leaving aside who made the rules, when were they made, who was consulted about, leave all that aside. Now they're no longer even pretending to adhere to any kind of rules. They break the rules they said yesterday were the rules that everyone must apply to. The best example this week, and there's an example every week, is the failure to condemn the destruction of the Iranian embassy consulate in Damascus. So we have to build an alternative power. We have to build an alternative media, and that's what I'm trying to do with this show, with the mother of all talk shows, with my social media platforms, and so on. We have to have a new political option on the ballot paper. Again, what I'm trying to do, I'm the leader of the Workers' Party of Britain. I'm trying to give the people somewhere else better to vote than the two cheeks of the same backside of the Uni Party. And we need to be demonstrating, as millions of people have all round the Western world for more than 6 months now, in the bitter cold of winter for the most part. We need to be boycotting, divesting, taking sanctions against the biggest criminals in the international arena. We need to be educating ourselves. I tell our young people in our party, read before you think, and think before you write, speak, and act. There's not enough reading going on, ma'am. Look around you at the young people that you see. How many of them are holding a book on the underground? When was the last time they read a book? So read before you think before you act, and act in a unified and disciplined manner. Don't be diverted by our enemies into foolish sectarianism, foolish identity politics. Do you pray like this or do you pray like that? Are you gay or straight? Are you black or white? Are you Muslim or Christian? Eschew these things and build a popular power that at elections and on the streets can shake the prevailing orthodoxy in its foundations. Let me go to London, stay in London. Latifa Abu Chakra in London. Go ahead, Latifa.
Hi, George. Thank you for everything. I said I had a good laugh at a few things that you mentioned, and seriously, you cool my heart because you say everything that we all want to hear. So thank you so much for being brave enough to do that. My question has to do with something that you pointed to earlier, and the UN Council submission by the Zionist entity. They began their submission by attempting to fan the flames of sectarianism and pointing to Iran as a state that threatens Islamic heritage sites, as well as the security of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And despite prominent members of the resistance in Palestine, like Shahid Nizar Banat, as well as the everyday Ghazan, professing their pride and their honor to be allied with Iran, some Muslims will continue to parrot the sectarian talking points, around Syria. How do you advise that we go about these type of conversations?
Well, it's one of the world's greatest mysteries, Latifa, how the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, Sunni Muslims to a man, can have all the support from Iran that they have had, military, political, diplomatic support, and how they can be popping up in Tehran on an almost daily basis, and yet some fools, some sectarian fools, continue to play these sectarian games. I myself try to mitigate, minimize sectarian differences, actually in the Christian world as well as in the Muslim world, because I know that it is a game that is fostered by the enemies of all of us. The enemies of Christ try to divide the followers of Christ into sectarian compartments, the better to distort and to thwart the central message of Christ. And the same is true in Islam. The people who heighten these sectarian tensions don't like Muslims of any kind, and certainly don't want to see a world in the Muslim world where the true principles of Islam and the true message of the Prophet Muhammad are delivered by states, by governments, by societies to the Muslim Ummah as a whole. I think Khomeini said, while they're having us fixated on which way we hold our arms in prayer, the enemy is seeking to cut off the arms of all of us, or something to that effect. I hope that metaphor is useful. Latifa, thank you. Thank you to all our panel on the video wall today. It's been, I think, the best show we've had so far. Thank you to Professor Marandi for his expertise. And above all, thanks to you for watching Have It Out with Galloway.